Okay, welcome listeners throughout time and space. Continuing a reading, Jurgen, A Comedy of Justice by James Branch Cabell. It's quite a sensation when first published in 1919. It's chapter 20, Efficacy of Prayer. Jurgen went in a tremble to the cathedral of the sacred thorn of Camellard. All night Jurgen prayed there, not in repentance, but in terror. For his dead he prayed that they should not have been blotted out in nothingness. For the dead among his kindred whom he had loved in boyhood, and for these only. About the men and women whom he had known since then, he did not seem to care, or not at least to so vitally. But he put up a sort of prayer for Dame Lisa. Wherever my dear wife may be, and O God, grant that I may come to her at last and be forgiven, he wailed, and wondered if he really meant it. He had forgotten about Guinevere, and nobody knows what were that night the thoughts of the young princess, nor if she offered any prayers in the deserted hall of judgment. In the morning, a sprinkling of persons came to early mass. Jurgen attended with fervor, and started doorward with the others. Just before him a merchant stopped to get a pebble from his shoe, and the merchant's wife went forward to the holy water font. "Madam, permit me," said a handsome young esquire, and offered her holy water. "At 11, said the merchant's wife in low tones. "He will be out all day." "My dear," says her husband as he rejoined her, "and who was the young gentleman?" "Why, I do not know, darling. I never saw him before." "He was certainly very civil. I wish there were more like him. And a fine-looking young fellow, too." "Was he? I did not notice," said the merchant's wife indifferently. And Jurgen saw and heard and regarded the departing trio ruefully. It seemed to him incredible the world should be going on just as it went before he ventured into the Druid forest. He paused before a crucifix, and he knelt and looked up wistfully. "If one could only know," says Jurgen, "what really happened in Judea, how immensely would matters be simplified. If any one but knew the truth about you, man upon the cross." Now the Bishop of Mirian passed him, coming from celebration of the early Mass. "My Lord Bishop," says Jurgen simply, "can you tell me the truth about this Christ?" "Why, indeed, Monsieur de Langres," replied the bishop, "one cannot but sympathize with Pilate in thinking that the truth about him is very hard to get at, even nowadays. Was he Melchizedek, or Shem, or Adam, or was he verily the Logos? And in that event, what sort of a something was the Logos? Granted he was a god. Were the Arians or the Sabellians in the right? Had he existed always co-substantial with the Father and the Holy Spirit? Or was he a creation of the Father, a kind of Israelite Zagreus? Was he the husband of Acharamoth, the degraded Sophia, as the Valentinians aver? Or the son of Panthyrus, as say the Jews? Or Calachus, as contends Basilides? Or was it, as the Decoti taught, only a tainted cloud in the shape of a man that went from Jordan to Golgotha? Or were the Marinthians right? These are a few of the questions, Monsieur de Langres, which naturally arise, and not all of them are to be settled out of hand. Thus speaking, the gallant prelate bowed, then raised 3 fingers in benediction, and so quieted Jurgen, who was still kneeling before the crucifix, and so quitted Jurgen, who was still kneeling before the crucifix. Ah, says Jurgen to himself, but what a variety of interesting problems are in point of fact suggested by religion, and what delectable exercise would the settling of these problems once for all afford the mind of a monstrous clever fellow. Come now, it might be well for me to enter the priesthood, and maybe that I have a call. But people were shouting in the street, so Jurgen rose and dusted his knees, and so Jurgen came out of the cathedral of the Sacred Thorn. The cavalcade was passing that bore away Dame Guinevere to the arms and throne of her appointed husband. Jurgen stood upon the cathedral porch, his mind in part preoccupied theology, but still not failing to observe how beautiful was this young princess, as she rode by on her white palfrey, green garbed and crowned with a glitter with jewels. She was smiling as she passed him, bowing her small, tenderly colored young countenance this way and that way to the shouting people, and not seeing Jurgen at all. Then she went to her bridal. Thus she went to her bridal, that Guinevere, who was the symbol of all beauty and purity to the chivalrous people of Galathnion. The mob worshipped her, and they spoke as though it were an angel who passed. Our beautiful young princess. Ah, there is none like her anywhere, and never a harsh word for anyone, they say. Oh, but she is the most admirable of ladies, and so brave, too, that lovely smiling child who is leaving her home forever. And so very, very pretty, so generous. King Arthur will be hard put to it to deserve her. Said Jurgen, now it is droll that to these truths I have but to add another truth, in order to have large paving stones flung at her, and to have myself tumultuously torn into fragments by those unpleasantly sweaty persons who, thank heaven, are no longer jostling me. For the cathedral porch had suddenly emptied because as the procession passed, heralds were scattering silver among the spectators. Arthur will have a very lovely queen, says a soft, lazy voice. And Jurgen turned and saw that beside him was Dame Anatis, whom people called the Lady of the Lake. Yes, he is greatly to be envied, says Jurgen politely. But do you not ride with them to London? Why, no, says the Lady of the Lake, because my part in this bridal was done when I missed the stirrup cup, of which the princess and young Lancelot drank this morning. He is the son of King Ban of Benwick, that tall young fellow in blue armor. I am partial to Lancelot, for I reared him at the bottom of a lake that belongs to me, and I consider he does me credit. I also believe that Madame Guinevere by this time agrees with me, and so my part being done to serve my Creator, I am off for Conseil. And what is this Conseil? It is an island wherein I rule. I did not know you were a queen, madam. Why, indeed, there are many things unknown to you, Monsieur de Langres. In a world where nobody gets any assuredness of knowledge about anything, for it is a world wherein all men that live have but a little while to live, and none knows his fate thereafter, so that a man possesses nothing certainly save a brief loan of his own body, and yet the body of man is capable of much curious pleasure. I believe, said Jurgen, as his thoughts shuddered away from what he had seen and heard in the Druid forest, that you speak wisdom. Then in Conscience we are all wise, for that is our religion. But of what are you thinking, Duke of Langres? I was thinking, says Jurgen, that your eyes are unlike the eyes of any other woman that I have ever seen. Smilingly, the dark woman asked him wherein they differed, and smilingly he said he did not know. They were looking at each other warily. In each glance, an experienced gamester acknowledged a worthy opponent. Why, then, you must come with me into Conscience, says Anitis, and see if you cannot discover wherein lies that difference, for it is not a matter I would care to leave unsettled. Well, that seems only just of you, says Jurgen. Yes, certainly I must deal fairly with you. Then they left the Cathedral of the Sacred Thorn, walking together. The folk who went toward London were now well out of sight and hearing, which possibly accounts for the fact that Jurgen was now in no wise thinking of Guinevere. So it was that Guinevere rode out of Jurgen's life for a while, and as she rode, she talked with Lancelot. Chapter 21. How Anitis voyaged. Now the tale tells that Jurgen and this lady of the lake came presently to the wharves of Camellard, and went aboard the ship which had brought Anitis and Merlin into Glathion. This ship was now to every appearance deserted, yet all its saffron-colored sails were spread, as though in readiness for the ship's departure. The crew are scrambling, it may be, for the largesse, and fighting over Gorgovan's silver pieces, says Anatas. But I think they will not be long in returning. So we will sit here upon the prow and await their leisure. But already the vessel moves, says Jurgen, and I hear behind us the rattling of silver chains and the flapping of shifted saffron-colored sails. They are roguish fellows, says Anitis, smiling. Evidently they have hid from us, pretending there was nobody aboard. Now they think to give us a surprise when the ship sets out to sea as though it were of itself. But we will disappoint these merry rascals by seeming to notice nothing unusual. So Jurgen sat with Anitis in the two tall chairs that were in the prow of the vessel, under a canopy of crimson stuff embroidered with gold dragons, and just back of the ship's figurehead, which was a dragon painted with 30 colors, and the ship moved out of the harbor and into the open sea. Thus they passed Enningsgarth, and it is a queer crew that serve you, Anitis. who are queen of Conscience, for I can hear them talking far back of us, and their language is all a cheeping and a twittering as though the mice and the bats were holding conference. Why, you must understand that these are outlanders who speak a dialect of their own, and are not like any other people you have ever seen. Indeed, now that is very probable, for I have seen some of your crew. Sometimes it is as though small flickerings passed over the deck, and that is all. It is but the beat waves rising from the deck, for the day is warmer than you would think sitting here under this canopy. And besides, what call have you and I to be bothering over the pranks of common mariners, so long as they do their proper duty? I was thinking, O woman with unusual eyes, that these are hardly common mariners. And I was thinking, Duke Jurgen, that I would tell you a tale of the old gods to make the time speed more pleasantly as we sit here untroubled as a god and a goddess. Now they had passed Camwai, and Aetus began to narrate the history of Anastar and Calmora, and of the unusual concessions they granted each other, and of how Calmora contented her 5 lovers, and Jurgen found the tale perturbing. While Aetus talked, the sky grew dark as though the sun were ashamed and veiled his shame with clouds. And they went forward in a gray twilight which deepened steadily over a tranquil sea. So they passed the lights of Sagrel, most remote of the Red Islands, where Aetus talked of Procris and King Minos and Pasiphae. As color went out of the air, new colors entered into the sea, which now assumed the varied gleams of water that has long been stagnant, and a silence brooded over the sea, so that there was no noise anywhere except the sound of the voice of Aetus saying, "All men that live have but a little while to live, and none knows his fate thereafter, so that a man possesses nothing certainly save a brief loan of his own body, and yet the body of man is capable of much curious pleasure." They came thus to a low-lying naked beach where there was no sign of habitation, and Aetus said this was the land they were seeking, and they went ashore. "Even now," says Jurgen, "I have seen none of the crew who brought us hither." And the beautiful dark woman shrugged and marveled why he need perpetually be bothering over the doings of common sailors. They went forward across the beach, through sand hills to a moor, seeing no one, and walking in a gray fog. They passed many gray, fat, sluggish worms, and some curious gray reptiles, such as Jurgen had never imagined to exist. But Aetus said these need not trouble them. "So there is no call to be fingering your charmed sword as we walk here, Duke Jurgen, for these great worms do not ever harm the living." "For whom then do they lie here and wait in this gray fog, where through the green lights flutter, and where through I hear at times a thin and far-off wailing?" What is that to you, Duke Jurgen, since you and I are still in the warm flush? Surely there was never a man who asked more idle questions. Yet this is an uncomfortable twilight. To the contrary, you should rejoice that it is a fog, too heavy to be penetrated by the moon. But what have I to do with the moon? Nothing as yet, and that is as well for you, Duke Jurgen, since it is authentically reported you have derided the day which is sacred to the moon. Now the moon does not love derision, as I well know, for in part I serve the moon. Eh? Says Jurgen, and he began to reflect. So they came to a wall that was high and gray, and to the door which was in the wall. You must knock 2 or 3 times, says Martinez, to get into Conseil. Jurgen observed the bronze knocker upon the door, and he grinned in order to hide his embarrassment. It is a quaint fancy, said he, and the 2 constituents of it appear to have been modeled from life. They were copied very exactly from Adam and Eve, says Martinez, who were the first persons to open this gateway. Why then, says Jurgen, there is no earthly doubt that men degenerate, since here under my hand is the proof of it. With that he knocked, and the door opened, and the 2 of them entered. Chapter 22, as to a veil they broke. So it was that Jurgen came into Conseil, wherein is the bedchamber of time. And time, they report, came in with Jurgen, since Jurgen was mortal. And time, they say, rejoiced in this respite from the slow toil of dilapidating cities, stone by stone, and with his eyes tired by the finicky work of etching in wrinkles, went happily into his bedchamber, and fell asleep just after sunset on this fine evening in late June, so that the weather remained fair and changeless, with no glaring sun rays anywhere, and with one large star shining alone in clear daylight. This was the star of Venus, Martinez, and Jurgen later derived considerable amusement from noting how this star had traveled about the dome of heaven by a largish beetle named Kefre, and the trees everywhere kept their first fresh foliage, and the birds were about their indolent evening songs all during Jurgen's stay in Conseil, for time had gone to sleep at the pleasantest hour of the year's most pleasant season, so tells the tale. And Jurgen's shadow also went in with Jurgen, but in Concierge, as in Galtheon, nobody save Jurgen seemed to notice this curious shadow, which now followed Jurgen everywhere. In Concierge, Queen Anaïs had a palace where domes and pinnacles beyond numbering glimmered with a soft whiteness, above the top of an old twilit forest, wherein the vegetation was unlike that which is nourished by ordinary earth. There was to be seen in these woods, for instance, a sort of moss which made Jurgen shudder. So Anytus and Jurgen came through narrow paths like murmuring green caverns into a courtyard walled and paved with yellow marble, wherein was nothing save the dimly colored statue of a god with 10 heads and 34 arms. He was represented as very much engrossed by a woman, and with his unoccupied hands was holding yet another woman. "It is Jigisbayet," said Anytus. Said Jurgen, "I do not criticize, nevertheless, I think this Jingibayet is carrying matters to extremes." Then they passed the statue of Tangaro Lolokwang, and afterward the statue of Legba. Jurgen stroked his chin, and his color heightened. "Now certainly, Queen Anytus," he said, "you have unusual tastes in sculpture." Thence Jurgen came with Anytus into a white room, with copper plaques upon the walls, and there 4 girls were heating water in a brass tripod. They bathed Jurgen, giving him astonishing caresses. Meanwhile, with the tongue, the hair, the fingernails, and the tips of the breasts, they anointed him with 4 oils, then dressed him again in his glittering shirt. Of Caliburn, said Anytus, there was no present need. No, Jurgen's sword was hung upon the wall. Those girls brought silver bowls containing wine mixed with honey, and they brought pomegranates and eggs and barley corn and triangular red-colored loaves, whereon they sprinkled sweet-smelling little seeds with formal gestures. Thus Anytus and Jurgen broke their fast, eating together while the 4 girls served them. "And now," says Jurgen, "and now, my dear, I would suggest that we enter into the pursuit of those curious pleasures of which you were telling me." "I am very willing," responded Anytus, "since there is no one of these pleasures but is purchased by some diversion of man's nature. Yet first, as I need hardly inform you, there is a ceremonial to be observed." "And what, pray, is this ceremonial?" "Why, we call it the breaking of the veil," and Queen Anytus explained what they must do. "Well," says Jurgen, "I am willing to taste any drink once." So Anytus led Jurgen into a sort of chapel, adorned with very unchurch-like paintings. There were 4 shrines dedicated severely to Saint Cosmo, to Saint Damasus, to Saint Gugnoil of Brest, and to Saint Photin de Varel. In this chapel were a hooded man clothed in long garments that were striped with white and yellow, and 2 naked children, both girls. One of the children carried a censer. The other held in one hand a vividly blue pitcher half filled with water, and in her left hand a cellar of salt. First of all, the hooded man made Jurgen ready. "Behold the lattice," said the hooded man, "which must serve you in this adventure." "I accept the adventure," Jurgen replied, "because I believe the weapon to be trustworthy." Said the hooded man, "So be it, but as you are, so once was I." Meanwhile, Duke Jurgen held the lance erect, shaking it with his right hand. This lance was large, and the tip of it was red with blood. "Behold," said Jurgen, "I am a man born of a woman incomprehensibly. Now I, who am miraculous and found worthy to perform a miracle and to create that which I may not comprehend." Martinez took salt and water from the child and mingled these. "Let the salt of earth enable the thin fluid to assume the virtue of the teeming sea." Then kneeling, she touched the lance and began to stroke it lovingly. To Jurgen she said, "Now may you be fervent of soul and body. May the endless serpent be your crown, and the fertile flame of the sun your strength." Said the hooded man again, "So be it." His voice was high and blasting and bleeding because of that which had been done to him. "That therefore which we cannot understand we also invoke," said Jurgen, "by the power of the lifted lance." And now with his left hand he took the hand of Martinez. "I, being a man born of a woman incomprehensibly, now seize upon that which alone I desire with my whole being. I lead you toward the east. I appraise you above the earth and all the things of earth." Then Jurgen raised Queen Martinez so that she sat upon the altar, and that which was there before tumbled to the ground. Martinez placed together the tips of her thumbs and of her fingers so that her hands made an open triangle, and waited thus. Upon her hand was a network of red coral with branches radiating downward. Her gauzy tunic had 22 openings so as to admit all imaginable caresses, and was of 2 colors, being shot with black and crimson curiously mingled. Her dark eyes glittered, and her breath came fast. Now the hooded man and the 2 naked girls performed their share in the ceremonial, which part it is not essential to record. But Jurgen was rather shocked by it. Nonetheless, Jurgen said, "O cord that binds the circling of the stars, O cup which holds all time, all color and all thought, O soul of space, not unto any image of thee do we attain unless thy image show in what we are about to do. Therefore, by every plant which scatters its seed, and by the moist, warm garden which receives and nourishes it, by the comminglement of bloodshed with pleasure, by the joy that mimics anguish with sighs and shudderings, and by the contentment which mimics death. By all these do we invoke thee, O thou continuous one, whose will these children attend, and whom I now adore in this fair-colored and soft woman's body. It is thou whom I honor, not any woman, in doing what seems good to me, and it is thou who art about to speak, and not she. Then Anytus said, Yes, for I speak with the tongue of every woman, and I shine in the eyes of every woman, whom when the lance is lifted. To serve me is better than all else, when you invoke me with a heart wherein is kindled the serpent flame. If but for a moment you will understand the delights of my garden, what joy unwordable pulsates therein, and how potent is the sole desire which uses all of a man. To serve me, you will then be eager to surrender whatever else is in your life, and other pleasures you will take with your left hand, not thinking of them entirely. For I am the desire which uses all of a man, and so wastes nothing. And I accept you, I yearn toward you, I who am daughter and somewhat more than daughter to the sun, I who am all pleasure, all ruin, and a drunkenness of the inmost sense, desire you. Now Jurgen held his lance erect before Anytus. O secret of all things, hidden in the being of all which lives, now that the lance is exalted, I do not dread thee, for thou art in me, and I am thou. I am the flame that burns in every beating heart, and in the core of the farthest star. I too am life, and the giver of life, and it's me too, and in me too is death. Wherein art thou better than I? I am alone, my will is justice, and there comes no other God where I am. Said the hooded man behind Jurgen, So be it, but as you are, so once was I. The two naked children stood one at each side of Anytus, and waited there trembling. These girls, as Jurgen afterward learned, were Alecto and Tisiphone, two of the Eumenides. And now Jurgen shifted the red point of the lance so that it rested in the open triangle made by the fingers of Anytus. I am life and the giver of life, cried Jurgen. Thou that art one, that makest use of all, I who am a man born of woman, I in my station honor thee in honoring this desire which uses all of a man. Make open, therefore, the way of creation. Encourage the flaming dust which is in our hearts, and aid us in that flame's perpetuation. For is not that thy law? Anytus answered, there is no law in concierge, save do that which seems good to you. Then said the naked children, perhaps it is the law, but certainly it is not justice. Yet we are little and quite helpless. So presently we must be made as you are. For now you two are no longer two, and your flesh is not shared merely with each other. For your flesh becomes our flesh, and your sins our sins, and we have no choice. Jurgen lifted Anytus from the altar, and they went into the chancel and searched for the adytum. There seemed to be no doors anywhere in the chancel, but presently Jurgen found an opening screened by a pink veil. Jurgen thrust with his lance and broke this veil. He heard the sound of one brief wailing cry. It was followed by soft laughter, so Jurgen came into the adytum. Black candles were burning in this place, and sulfur too was burning there before a scarlet cross, of which the top was a circle, and whereon was nailed a living toad. And other curious matters Jurgen likewise noticed. He laughed and turned to Anytus. Now that the candles were behind him, she was standing in his shadow. Well, well, but you are a little old-fashioned with all these equivocal mummeries, and I did not know that civilized persons any longer retained sufficient credulity to wring a thrill from God-baiting. Still, woman must be humored, bless them, and at last, I take it, we have quite fairly fulfilled the ceremonial requisites to the pursuit of curious pleasures. Queen Anytus was very beautiful, even under his bedimming shadow. Triumphant, too, was the proud face beneath that curious coral network, and yet this woman's face was sad. Dear fool, she said, it was not wise, when you sang of the Leshy, to put an affront upon Monday. But you have forgotten that, and now you laugh because that which we have done you do not understand, and equally that which I am you do not understand. No matter what you may be, my dear, I am sure that you will presently tell me all about it, for I assume that you mean to deal fairly with me. I shall do that which becomes me, Duke Jurgen. That it is it, my dear, precisely. You intend to be true to yourself, whatever happens. The aspiration does you infinite honor, and I shall try to help you. Now I have noticed that every woman is most truly herself, says Jurgen, oracularly, in the dark. Then Jurgen looked at her for a moment with twinkling eyes. Then Anytus, standing in his shadow, smiled with glowing eyes. Then Jurgen blew out those black candles, and then it was quite dark. Please come back for more. And the recording is being archived on the YouTube Roarshock channel at YouTube. Please subscribe. Thanks very much for listening. And I shall return with more. Thanks.